My name is Alina Brooks, and 3 years ago, my parents skipped my college graduation, calling my degree completely pointless. They didn't say it to my face at first. They said it in the passive, polite way that wealthy suburban parents use when they want to destroy your confidence without leaving a fingerprint. My mother told her bridge club that I was taking a gap year to find myself, and my father told his golf buddies that I was struggling to choose a major. The truth was, I had already graduated summa cum laude with a degree in environmental systems engineering. I had a 4.02 published research papers on coastal infrastructure resilience, and a signed offer letter from a federal climate risk analytics firm. But to my parents, if it didn't involve a stethoscope, a courtroom, or a corner office in a glass skyscraper, it wasn't a real career. They wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer because those titles looked good on their country club membership applications. When I told them I wanted to model flood risks and design sustainable urban drainage systems, my father actually laughed. He thought I was joking when I didn't laugh back. His expression hardened into that familiar look of profound disappointment that I had seen my entire life. The weeks leading up to graduation were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. My mother kept bringing up my cousin Daniel, who had just finished his MBA and was starting a hedge fund. She would casually mention his new Rolex or his leased Porsche, always making sure I was in earshot. My father started asking me if I had considered taking a year off to work at his mid-sized real estate development firm, Brooks & Sons, as an unpaid intern. He framed it as an opportunity, but the subtext was clear. He wanted to prove that my degree was useless in the real world. I politely declined, explaining that my new job started 2 weeks after commencement. That was the first time I saw the real anger in his eyes. He didn't yell, he just went quiet, which was his way of punishing me. The night before the ceremony, I called them to confirm their flight details. I had paid for their tickets myself, using the stipend from my final year research grant. My mother hesitated on the phone, her voice tight. She told me that Daniel's engagement party had been moved to the exact same weekend. I reminded her that Daniel's party was on Saturday night, and my graduation was on Saturday morning. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Then my father got on the phone. He told me that family comes first, and that celebrating Daniel's engagement was a priority, he said, and I quote, that walking across a stage to get a piece of paper in a field nobody understands wasn't worth the airfare. He told me to be practical. He told me to stop chasing pointless dreams and come home so we could discuss my future. I didn't argue. I just said okay, hung up the phone, and canceled their tickets. I didn't refund them to myself. I donated the money to a scholarship fund for first-generation engineering students. Graduation day was beautiful. The sun was shining, the campus was filled with proud families, and the air smelled like blooming jasmine and cheap champagne. I put on my cap and gown, adjusted my tassel, and walked across that stage alone. I didn't look at the empty seats in the bleachers. I looked straight ahead, took my diploma, and smiled for the camera. When I walked off the stage, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. It just said, "Hope it went well. Let us know when you're ready to talk about real jobs." I turned off my phone, threw it in my bag, and went to celebrate with the only people who actually cared about my success, my professors and my lab partners. That night, I cried in my dorm room. Not because I was sad, but because the grief of realizing your parents will never truly see you is a very specific, very heavy kind of pain. You mourn the parents you wish you had, while still living with the ones you actually have. I wiped my face, packed my bags, and the next morning, I drove 6 hours to Austin, Texas, to start my new life. My first job was grueling. I was a junior risk analyst at a boutique climate modeling firm. We didn't have the budget of the big corporations, so we worked twice as hard for half the recognition. My days started at 6 in the morning and rarely ended before 9 at night. I spent my weekends learning advanced software and studying urban planning codes. I was building a house on a foundation of pure, unadulterated competence. I didn't have my parents' financial safety net to fall back on. So every mistake felt like a potential eviction notice. I lived in a tiny studio apartment with a mattress on the floor and a hot plate for a stove. I ate rice and beans, drank cheap coffee, and worked until my eyes burned. But I loved it. I loved the logic of the math. I loved the tangible impact of the worked out when we successfully modeled a flood mitigation strategy for a vulnerable coastal town in Louisiana, and the local government actually implemented our I felt a sense of pride that no country club invitation could ever give me. I was building a life that was entirely my own, brick by brick, data point by data point. For the first 2 years, I didn't speak to my parents. I sent a brief text on their birthdays and Christmas, and they replied with equally brief, cold acknowledgments. I heard through the grapevine that my father's real estate firm was struggling. The market had shifted, commercial vacancies were up, and his heavy reliance on outdated, higher-risk coastal developments was coming back to bite him. My mother was spending more and more time at the country club, trying to maintain the illusion of their wealth. I felt a pang of sympathy for them, but I knew that if I reached out, they would use my empathy as a weapon to pull me back into their orbit. So I stayed away. I focused on my work. I got promoted to senior analyst, then to lead modeler. I started managing a team of 5. I was 25 years old, and I was already directing multi-million-dollar risk assessments for municipal governments. I was good at what I did. I was undeniable. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. My boss, a brilliant but perpetually exhausted man named David, called me into his office. He closed the door, which he never did unless it was serious. He told me that our firm had been acquired, not by a competitor, but by a massive global energy transition and infrastructure conglomerate, a $10 billion valuation company. They weren't just absorbing our team. They were expanding it aggressively to dominate the North American climate risk market. David told me that the executive board had been reviewing our recent projects, and my name had come up repeatedly. Specifically, my predictive model for hurricane surge impacts on urban drainage systems had caught the eye of their chief operating officer. 2 days later, I was flown to their headquarters in New York City. I sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor, presenting my framework to a board of 12 executives. I didn't try to impress them with jargon. I spoke clearly, confidently, and backed every claim with irrefutable data. I answered their questions without hesitation. I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize for my age or my gender. I just laid out the facts. After the presentation, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, stopped me in the hallway. She asked me how old I was. I told her. She nodded slowly, looking at me with a calculating expression. She asked if I would be willing to relocate to their main hub and take on a director-level role. I told her I would need to see the compensation package. The next morning, they sent me a contract. My base salary was triple what I was making, but the real number was the equity package and the performance bonuses. When I added it all up, the total first-year compensation was over $5 million. $5 million. I sat on the edge of my mattress in my tiny apartment, staring at the screen, reading the number 4 times before my brain actually processed it. I wasn't just comfortable. I was wealthy. I was independently, undeniably, generationally wealthy. I signed the contract electronically, packed my few belongings, and moved to New York. I didn't call my parents. I didn't post about it on social media. I just went to work. 3 days after I officially started, the company issued a press release announcing their new leadership team in the climate risk division. My name and photo were in the release. I didn't think much of it. It was standard corporate PR. But the internet is a small world, and my hometown is even smaller. 2 days after the press release went live, my phone rang. The caller ID said Mom. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Her voice was breathless, excited, and laced with a fake warmth that made my skin crawl. She told me she had seen an article in the local business journal about a Brooks making executive waves at a $10 billion company. She said she knew it was me. but she had to ask. I confirmed it was me. She gasped a theatrical sound and immediately asked to put my dad on the phone. He came on the line, his voice booming with a pride he hadn't felt in years. He told me he always knew I had it in me. He said he always believed in me, even when I was struggling to find my path. The sheer audacity of the revisionist history was almost impressive. I just said thank you and waited for the other shoe to drop. It dropped about 30 seconds later. My dad cleared his throat and said they were having a family dinner on Sunday. He said it was time we sat down and had a real family meeting. He said there were things we needed to discuss. Now that I was in such a powerful position, I could hear the greed dripping from his words, disguised as familial duty. I looked at my calendar. I had a massive presentation on Monday morning, and I was supposed to be reviewing data all weekend. But I looked at the phone, and a cold, calm clarity washed over me. I realized that this was the moment I had been working for. Not for the money, but for the leverage. I told him I would be there. I hung up the phone, opened my laptop, and started doing some research. I pulled up the public financial records for Brooks & Sons, my father's real estate development firm. I looked at their recent acquisitions, their debt-to-equity ratios, and their current project pipelines. What I found made me smile. My father's company was drowning. They had over-leveraged themselves on 3 massive coastal commercial properties that were now uninsurable due to the exact flood risks my firm specialized in. Their primary lender was calling in their loans. They were 60 days away from bankruptcy. I spent the next 2 days preparing for this family meeting. I didn't just prepare my talking points. I prepared a surprise. I reached out to Sarah, my COO, and asked her about our firm's current acquisition targets for distressed real estate portfolios in the Mid-Atlantic region. She told me we were actively looking for undervalued coastal assets to retrofit and resell. I sent her the portfolio of Brooks & Sons. By Friday afternoon, our legal team had drafted a preliminary letter of intent. My company was going to buy my father's failing business, and because of the debt structure, they were going to buy it for pennies on the dollar. I was going to be the majority stakeholder. I was going to be my father's boss. I packed my bags, booked a first-class ticket, and flew home. I didn't tell them I was coming. I just showed up at their house on Sunday evening, right at 6 o'clock, just as the dinner was being served. When I pulled into the driveway that Sunday evening, nothing about the house had changed. The same white columns, the same perfectly trimmed hedges, the same porch light, flickering like it had for years, because my father refused to replace anything until it completely failed. From the outside, it still looked like stability, like control, like legacy. But I had seen the numbers. I knew better. I sat in the rental car for a moment before stepping out, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to walk in centered. Calm power always lands harder than emotional reaction. When I rang the doorbell, my mother opened it almost immediately. She looked polished as always, styled hair, pressed blouse, diamond studs, but there was strain behind her smile. "Alina," she said, as if she were testing how the name felt in her mouth now. "You look successful." I smiled slightly. "I am." She laughed softly and pulled me into a hug that felt more ceremonial than maternal. Inside, the dining room lights were bright. The table was fully set. My father sat at the head like he always had. My aunt and uncle were already seated. Daniel was there too, freshly engaged, checking his phone until he noticed me. Every head turned at once. It felt less like dinner, and more like a board review. The positioning wasn't accidental. He liked control. He liked direct lines. Dinner began with small talk. My mother asked about my apartment in New York. My aunt asked about corporate culture. Daniel made a comment about whether I had security escorts yet. They were fishing, trying to gauge the scale of my world without asking directly. I answered simply, and without numbers. I wasn't there to impress them. I was there to observe. My father finally set his fork down and cleared his throat. The room quieted immediately. "We're very proud of you," he began. "Your achievements are significant." I nodded once. "Thank you." He folded his hands. "That's actually why we wanted to gather tonight. There it was. My mother leaned forward slightly. You're in a powerful position now, Alina. Executive leadership, access to resources, strategic capital. The language was corporate, not parental. My father continued. Brooks and Sons is experiencing a temporary liquidity situation. Temporary? That was generous. The coastal developments have encountered unexpected insurance recalculations. I almost smiled. Insurance also known as climate risk, exactly what I had studied, exactly what they had mocked. My father stood but didn't hug me. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm, measured, competitive. Good to see you, he said. We've been following your progress. The pause before the last word was intentional. I took my seat across from him, the same seat I'd occupied since childhood. He looked at me carefully. Your company specializes in predictive infrastructure modeling, correct? Yes, I said evenly. And you influence capital allocation decisions? Yes. He leaned back slightly. Then perhaps this is an opportunity for alignment, synergy, collaboration. They had prepared these words. Daniel chimed in. If you could endorse a restructuring plan or bring institutional backing, lenders would stabilize. With your credibility attached, the optics alone would shift. Optics, that word mattered. This wasn't about belief in my expertise. It was about using my title as collateral. My mother placed her hand on the table. This is what family does. We support each other. I held her gaze. You didn't support my graduation. The air shifted. My father's jaw tightened. That was 3 years ago. Yes, I replied. It was. My aunt shifted uncomfortably. Daniel looked down at his plate. My father's tone sharpened. We're not here to revisit emotional grievances. Of course not. Emotions were inconvenient when leverage was needed. You're here because you need capital, I said calmly. My uncle jumped in quickly. We're here because we believe in strategic partnership. I reached into my bag, slowly, and removed a thin leather folder. I placed it gently on the table. My father frowned.
What's that?
An alternative, I replied. I opened the folder and slid a document across to him. It was a formal letter of intent, clean, structured, professional. My company has been reviewing distressed coastal portfolios across the region, I said. Brooks and Sons meets acquisition criteria. My mother's eyes widened. Daniel actually leaned forward. My father didn't touch the paper at first. You're joking, no? Silence pressed down heavily. Based on your public filings, I continued, your firm will face insolvency within 90 days without capital injection. That's speculation, he snapped. It's financial modeling. He finally picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the page. The color drained from his face gradually, not dramatically. Daniel read over his shoulder. This valuation is aggressive, Daniel muttered. It's accurate, I said. My father's voice dropped lower. You're trying to buy my company. I'm offering to prevent bankruptcy at a discount, at market reality. The distinction was important. My mother whispered, Elena, is this revenge? I looked at her steadily. If it were revenge, I wouldn't be offering acquisition. I would let the lenders liquidate. That shut down the emotional framing immediately. The decision. Now I was presenting terms. He stood up slowly. My father placed the paper down carefully. And what exactly would my role be in this arrangement? Senior Regional Advisor, I replied. You would report to the executive board, and you, he asked, though he already knew. I sit on that board. The room felt smaller. For years, he had been the authority at this table. The evaluator? You investigated my company. Public information, I said. Due diligence. His voice rose slightly. You planned this? Yes. Why? I paused deliberately before answering. Because you taught me stability matters. That landed. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride versus survival. Ego versus arithmetic. If we decline, Daniel asked quietly, then your primary lender initiates restructuring. You lose operational control anyway. That wasn't a threat. It was math. My mother looked overwhelmed now. My aunt avoided eye contact entirely. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but I wasn't gloating. I wasn't smiling. I was steady. You have 48 hours, I said. After that, the board reallocates capital elsewhere. I stood and gathered my coat. My mother rose to, "You're leaving already. I have work tomorrow." My father spoke again just as I reached the doorway. "You think this proves something?" I turned slightly. "It doesn't need to." I walked out without slamming the door. Without theatrics, without anger. Outside, the air felt cool and clear. I got into the car and closed the door softly. My phone buzzed almost instantly. A message from Sarah. How did it go? I looked back at the house, the same house where my degree had been called pointless. I typed back calmly. Exactly as projected. I didn't wait 48 hours for their answer. I gave them 48 hours because that's what professionals do. But I already knew how this would end. My father had built his identity around control. Losing operational authority would feel worse to him than losing the company itself. But numbers don't bend to pride, and lenders don't negotiate with ego. When I landed back in New York the next morning, I went straight from the airport to the office. I didn't dramatize the dinner in my head. I didn't replay his tone or my mother's expression. I opened my laptop and moved forward by noon. Our legal department had prepared 2 parallel tracks: acquisition approval, if they accepted, and competitive acquisition if the lender forced default. Either way, Brooks & Sons was entering our portfolio. The only question was whether my father would sign willingly or watch it happen without him. 36 hours later, my phone rang. It wasn't my mother this time. It was my father. His voice was different, less sharp, more contained. "We need to discuss terms," he said. "Not we reject. Not this is unacceptable. We need to discuss terms." That told me everything. I scheduled a formal call through my assistant, not directly. That detail mattered. The conversation shifted from personal to procedural. On the call were our CFO, our head of legal, and my father. Daniel was there too, silent most of the time. My father tried to renegotiate valuation, citing brand equity and long-standing community relationships. Our CFO calmly referenced declining revenue curves, rising insurance premiums, and lender pressure. It wasn't personal, it was data. After 90 minutes, my father's resistance softened into bargaining. By the end of the call, he agreed to the majority acquisition structure with minor adjustments to his advisory compensation. He signed electronically that evening. The press release went out 2 weeks later. Global Infrastructure Holdings announces strategic acquisition of Brooks & Sons coastal portfolio. My name was quoted in the statement as Executive Director of Risk Integration. The language emphasized preservation of local jobs, modernization of outdated assets, and forward-looking resilience planning. There was no mention of family, no mention of history, just strategy. In my hometown, the reaction was immediate. The same people who had whispered that my degree was useless were now reposting articles about visionary leadership and bold, generational transitions. My mother texted me screenshots of neighbors congratulating her. She didn't mention the graduation again. The first time I walked into the Brooks & Sons headquarters as a board representative, it felt surreal but not triumphant. The building smelled the same. The reception desk hadn't changed. Employees looked confused but cautiously hopeful. They weren't the problem. They were collateral in a system built on denial. I held a town hall that afternoon. I explained the acquisition clearly. No immediate layoffs. Phased property retrofits. Updated flood mitigation standards. Structural reinforcements. Insurance renegotiations based on revised risk modeling. I saw relief ripple through the room. Stability. That word again. After the meeting, my father approached me privately in his old office. It was technically no longer his, but we had allowed him to keep it during transition. He closed the door and stood by the window, not looking at me at first. "You move differently now," he said. It wasn't criticism. It was observation. "So do markets," I replied. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "You were always stubborn. You called it impractical." I corrected gently. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he turned. You didn't have to handle it this way. That sentence carried layers. I could have rescued him quietly. I could have injected capital anonymously. I could have softened the blow. Yes, I said. I did. He studied me carefully, trying to locate the anger. There wasn't any, just clarity. You wanted control, he said. No, I answered. I wanted sustainability. In the months that followed, the integration was intense. Our engineers began evaluating each coastal asset. Some buildings required foundational elevation. Others needed complete drainage redesign. A few were beyond salvage and slated for redevelopment. I oversaw risk compliance personally. It wasn't about proving something anymore. It was about protecting what we had absorbed. Daniel left within 3 months. He claimed he wanted to pursue new ventures. But I knew the shift in hierarchy unsettled him. My aunt and uncle stopped calling as often. The energy had changed. My mother, however, began reaching out in quieter ways. She asked about my schedule. She sent articles about climate adaptation. Once, she forwarded me a scholarship announcement and said it reminded her of me. Small gestures, not apologies, but acknowledgments. One evening, about 6 months after the acquisition, my father requested a one-on-one meeting at headquarters. Not his office, mine. He arrived early and sat waiting, reviewing quarterly reports like he used to. When I entered, he stood automatically, then seemed to realize he didn't have to. We sat across from each other at a glass conference table. He spoke first. Your projections were right, he admitted. If you hadn't stepped in, the lenders would have stripped everything that was as close to gratitude as he had ever come. This isn't about being right, I said. It's about adapting before collapse. He nodded slowly. I underestimated that field, he said quietly. That was the closest he would ever get to apologizing for calling it pointless. I didn't press him further. Growth, even incremental, counts. Publicly, the acquisition became a case study in strategic climate adaptation. Business journals covered the turnaround. Analysts praised the integration model. Invitations started arriving for speaking engagements. At one conference, a journalist asked me how it felt to acquire the firm that once doubted your career path. I paused before answering. It wasn't about doubt, I said. It was about data. The room laughed lightly, but I wasn't joking. Emotional narratives are satisfying. Structural shifts are lasting. Financially, my position strengthened beyond what I had imagined 3 years earlier. The equity package matured. Performance bonuses triggered early due to successful integration. But wealth stopped feeling like validation. It became a tool. I established a private foundation, focused on funding climate, resilience programs in underrepresented communities quietly. No family branding, no ribbon cuttings, just structural impact. I funded scholarships for engineering students whose families didn't understand their degrees yet. I didn't attach my last name to them. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after that first dinner, my parents visited my New York apartment. It was modest compared to what I could afford, but intentional. Clean lines, natural light, no unnecessary excess. My mother walked slowly through the space, taking it in. My father stood near the windows, looking at the skyline. You built this yourself, he said. Yes, he nodded once. There was no critique this time. No alternative suggestion, just recognition. We had dinner without negotiation, without proposals. It wasn't warm in the way television families are warm, but it was stable. That was enough. Looking back, the most important shift wasn't the acquisition or the compensation. It was the internal recalibration. When they skipped my graduation, they thought they were sending a message about practicality. What they actually did was sever the need for their approval. Once that cord was cut, I stopped building to be seen and started building to be effective. That difference compounds faster than money ever could. If they had attended that ceremony, cheered politely, and continued doubting quietly, I might have chased validation longer. Their absence forced independence. People often ask whether I ever felt tempted to humiliate them publicly. The honest answer is no. Humiliation is reactive. Structure is permanent. I didn't need them to feel small. I needed the system to function. The irony is that by refusing to treat my field as legitimate, they created the conditions that allowed me to dominate it. Resistance sharpened focus. Dismissal strengthened resolve. When they called my degree pointless, they were measuring value by familiarity. Markets measure by necessity. Climate risk isn't theoretical anymore. It's financial. It's structural. It's unavoidable. Today, Brooks & Sons operates under a new name, fully integrated into our coastal resilience division. My father still works there in an advisory capacity. He arrives early. He studies updated risk models. Sometimes he asks technical questions he never would have considered years ago. I answer them without sarcasm. Growth doesn't require bitterness. It requires adjustment. My mother tells her friends I design cities that survive storms. That description is close enough. The graduation they skipped no longer stings. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was a doorway. They missed the ceremony. They didn't miss the outcome. And sometimes that's the real shift. Approval after proof is different than belief before it, but both change the landscape in their own way. I don't romanticize what happened. I don't frame it as revenge or poetic justice. It was alignment. Reality caught up to denial. Data otren ego. And I stayed steady long enough to see it. Through DOT by the end of the first full year. After the acquisition, the transformation was measurable, not just financially, but structurally. The coastal properties that had once been liabilities were now case studies in adaptive redevelopment, elevated foundations, reinforced substructures, advanced drainage systems modeled with predictive surge analytics. Insurance premiums dropped, investor confidence returned. What had once been considered reckless overextension became a controlled resilience portfolio. Industry publications began citing the turnaround as an example of proactive climate alignment rather than reactive loss management. I was invited to speak on panels about sustainable restructuring, about generational shifts in leadership, about how legacy companies can evolve instead of collapse. Every time someone asked how, I predicted the coastal insurance crash before others did. I resisted the temptation to say, I wrote my thesis on it while you were laughing at the field. Instead, I explained the math. Always the math. My father adapted more slowly than the company did. At first, he attended meetings defensively, arms crossed, challenging projections that contradicted his past instincts. But numbers have a way of wearing down resistance. After several quarters of improved performance, he stopped pushing against the data and started studying it. He began asking sharper questions about floodplain mapping and mitigation incentives. He read the technical briefs my team circulated. Once, during a strategy session, he corrected a junior manager's outdated assumption about coastal risk exposure. I watched the moment quietly. It wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. Adaptation had moved from forced compliance to active engagement. Pride hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected. My mother's transformation was subtler. She stopped framing my career as something abstract and began describing it with clarity. At a community fundraiser, she introduced me to someone as my daughter. She leads infrastructure, risk strategy for a global firm. There was no hesitation this time, no vague phrasing. She had learned the language. That mattered more than she realized. One evening, over dinner in New York, she admitted she hadn't understood what I studied back then. It sounded political, she said softly, and we were afraid politics would limit you. I didn't correct her. Fear often disguises itself as criticism. I simply told her that fear rarely predicts the future accurately. She nodded, absorbing that. The public narrative around the acquisition continued to grow. Business schools reached out, requesting permission to turn the Brooks & Sons restructuring into a teaching case. I agreed, with one condition: remove personal framing. No daughter saves father's company storyline. Make it about systems, about adaptation, about strategic foresight. They complied. I didn't want my success reduced to a family drama arc. It wasn't about personal redemption. It was about structural correction. Markets evolve. Companies either evolve with them or dissolve. That's not emotional. That's arithmetic. Financially, my equity position matured significantly as the integration succeeded. The compensation that once felt surreal became routine. I diversified investments carefully, resisting the urge to indulge in performative wealth. I purchased a larger apartment eventually, but it remained intentional rather than extravagant. I invested heavily in climate tech startups led by engineers who reminded me of myself at 22. Brilliant, underestimated, slightly isolated. I funded mentorship, networks for students entering sustainability fields from families who didn't understand their choices. I never attached my parents' name to those initiatives. Quiet impact compounds faster than public applause. There was one final moment, however, that shifted everything internally. It happened nearly 8 months after that dinner where I placed the acquisition letter on the table. I received an invitation from my alma mater to deliver the keynote at graduation. The same stage, the same ceremony my parents had skipped. I considered declining at first. I didn't need symbolic closure, but something about the symmetry felt earned. I accepted. On the day of the ceremony, I stood backstage in a simple black dress, holding a speech I barely glanced at. I didn't plan to speak about family. I planned to speak about structural courage. When my name was announced, I walked across that stage again, this time, not as a student, but as the keynote speaker. The applause was sustained and genuine. As I looked out into the crowd, I saw my parents sitting in the front row. They had arrived early. My father wore a dark suit. My mother held the program in both hands like it was fragile. They weren't distracted. They weren't checking phones. They were present. I began my speech calmly. I talked about underestimation, about choosing fields that others dismiss, because they don't yet understand their necessity. I spoke about markets catching up to truth. I told the graduates that validation often arrives late, and when it does, it feels different than imagined. I did not mention my parents. I did not recount the skipped ceremony. I simply said, build what you know is needed, even if the room you're in can't see it yet. That line lingered in the air. After the ceremony, my father approached me quietly. He didn't extend his hand this time. He hugged me. It was brief, slightly awkward, but real. You were right, he said, voice low enough that no one else could hear. Not about the acquisition. Not about the money. Just those 3 words. You were right. My mother's eyes were wet. She didn't speak much, just squeezed my hand. There was no dramatic apology, no tearful confession, but something fundamental had shifted. Recognition had replaced resistance. Driving away from campus that afternoon, I realized that the story had never been about proving them wrong. It had been about refusing to let their doubt dictate my direction. Their absence at my first graduation had felt like rejection. In hindsight, it was insulation. It forced me to anchor internally instead of externally. The acquisition wasn't revenge. It was inevitability intersecting with preparation. They measured success by tradition. I measured it by relevance. Relevance wins long term. Today, Brooks & Sons, now fully integrated under a new name, operates profitably within a climate-forward framework. My father contributes experience shaped by decades in development, now filtered through updated risk realities. My mother occasionally forwards me articles about sustainable urban design with small comments like, thought this might interest you. They've stopped calling my degree pointless. They've stopped suggesting alternative paths. They've stopped treating my field as temporary. That quiet cessation is louder than any apology. When I look back at the girl who stood alone at graduation, I don't feel sadness anymore. I feel gratitude for her restraint. She didn't argue. She didn't beg for attendance. She walked the stage and kept moving. That forward motion is what changed everything. Success wasn't explosive. It was incremental, disciplined, patient. The acquisition wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. The reconciliation wasn't emotional. It was gradual, and that's what makes it real. If there is a lesson in any of this, it's not about revenge or humiliation. It's about durability. When people dismiss your work because they can't see its future, that says more about their timeline than your value. The market eventually corrects denial. Reality eventually outpaces comfort. And when that happens, the only question is whether you built quietly enough, consistently enough, to be ready. I did. And when the moment came, I didn't raise my voice. I presented terms,